All right, so it looks like that is good to go. So I am Lauren Kelly. I'm the Technical Services Consultant here at the Vermont Department of Libraries. If we haven't met before, hello, nice to see you here. Feel free to keep your camera on or off for the duration of class today, really up to you. Utilize the chat. I'll try and keep an eye on it and read things aloud as I see them come in. But we're basically going to go through a presentation today on classification. And then we have a wonderful guest speaker to talk about an alternate arrangement for the 200s in the Dewey Decimal System. So let's get started here. I am going to share my presentation. All right, can I get a verbal confirmation that this is showing?
Yes.
Thank you. Okay, so as I said, I'm Lauren Kelly. We're talking about classification today. Just make sure that I can see what's going on. All right, perfect. All right, so our goals for today, well, here's the overview. We're going to go through some goals. We're going to talk a little bit about the history of classification. We're going to go into some schema. There's a whole bunch as we'll get into. We'll talk about the application of classification, the real world applicability. We'll go through some of the mark fees of presentation from Matthew Vasquez Jaquith from the Springfield Central Library. So after today, hopefully you'll gain an understanding of classification and its role in our libraries. You'll be able to use new tools to aid in that process. Hopefully you'll feel more confident in applying classifications to material. And of course, you'll have my information to reach out if you ever have questions or things you want to discuss, get a second opinion. I'm always here for that. So when it comes to classification, it is a very specific part of cataloging. From this wonderful article, Handicapped Has Been Canceled, Terminology and Logistics of Disability and Cultural Heritage Institutions, which just came out, I believe, in February. Very interesting article talking about subject headings and classification. And this kind of had an interesting definition about how the second step in cataloging is classification. It's the process of placing items in related groups on a shelf, which makes finding and retrieving it easier. Variations on this process are repeated in other GLAMs, galleries, libraries, archives, museums, and special collections. Classification, the object's physical location, that's an important aspect of what we're talking about today. It's about space and place, is determined by cataloging, but classification systems, like the Library of Congress classification or Dewey Decimal, are developed usually by large information organizations such as national libraries. So we'll be going over some schema, talking about how there are usually bodies, institutions that are the authority of that classification scheme. Like I said, pertains to space and place. And there's this Aristotle quote about how things are placed into the same category based on what they have in common. Category is like an abstract container with things either inside or outside the container. And generally, when we talk about classification, especially using different schema, we are mostly talking about nonfiction. So probably always default to talking about nonfiction, even if I don't say that. And one thing that I was thinking about recently as it came up in a book that I was reading, it was talking about how our experience is based on perceptions and categories, and how those two things relate to each other. So kind of the goal of today, I want to talk about how we can get a clear perception of the material that we're working with, kind of in a time-efficient way, because we all know that, you know, we don't have forever to think about the classification of one item when we have a cart full of items to get through. So I want to keep that in mind. So when we're talking about classification, we're ultimately talking about the call numbers. The call number reflected on the spine label versus a general label, a color code system, or genre stickers. We are talking about the notation based on a classification scheme found in a schedule, which can be online or print, that explains the different classes in the scheme. And generally, classes are hierarchical. Categories go from general to specific with the numbers. We'll see that in Dewey. And generally, they're faceted, which means that you can make decisions about the length and specificity of the way that those things are applied. That'll make more sense when we actually look at examples. So a couple of early classifiers for knowledge organization systems, KOS. You'll hear that a lot in material talking about classification. Very early on, we have Sir Francis Bacon, who wrote The Advancement of Learning in 1605, which talked about how we kind of think of these concepts and how we organize and make hierarchies out of knowledge. And then we have this French gentleman who came up with the arrangement for Diderot's Encyclopedia, one of the first encyclopedias that was published. And Thomas Jefferson is another example of an early classifier. His personal library actually was adopted into the Library of Congress in 1814 after a fire that destroyed the earlier collection. That was kind of an interesting thing. So a lot of the way that he organized his materials, based on past thinkers like Bacon and D'Alembert. So that influenced the way that the Library of Congress was organized. And, we still feel that effect today with Library of Congress classification. And then, of course, we'll talk a lot about Melville Dewey coming up with the Dewey Decimal Classification, and Charles Ami Cutter. He came up with the Cutter Expansive Classification, which we will see that influence in the Library of Congress classification, which we'll get into. Throughout this presentation today, there are a couple of points to ponder, just things that kind of came up as I was thinking about what I wanted to go over. If anyone has any thoughts as we're going through these things, or if anyone feels like they want to respond to any of these points to ponder, I welcome that highly. So one thing when it comes to early classifiers is that if we think about the library and stacks and how classification is about placement, we have to remember that a lot of pre-19th century stacks were closed, meaning the person who these call numbers were for was the librarian, and basically the librarian alone. They were the ones who needed to retrieve material requested. There was no patron browsing. So when we think about classifying items today, and we'll get into this later when we kind of talk about current trends, there is a big push for adopting kind of browsing models and more bookstore models, which is totally about patrons wandering through the stacks. When we think about these early classification schemes, they weren't thinking of that at all. So it's just kind of interesting to keep that in mind with some of maybe the inflexibilities that we're facing today with classification schemes, because they were not created with that intention. So point to ponder. An important figure that is worth mentioning is Dorothy Porter Wesley. I would say she's a contemporary, and she was influential in desegregating Dewey Decimal Classification. She was instrumental at Howard University. She founded the Moreland Springard Research Center, which still functions to this day, collecting material about the African diaspora in many different countries. And her work kind of got at the complexities of talking about both race and gender in materials and using a kind of more inclusive take or a more flexible take for these schema to reflect the material and the whole kind of the field of study to which users of that library would be looking for or thinking about their framework. Also an interesting concept to think about: who is doing the work of classification, how does that impact, as well as who is then the authority for these classification systems, and what are they bringing into the system itself. Talking about more different movements of almost disruption in a way, we have the Social Responsibilities Roundtable, which was started in 1971 through ALA, and their concerns had to do with bibliographic classification, and subject headings as well. It had a gay and lesbian task force, which included in its statement of purpose the goal to revise classification schemes and subject headings list in order to remove homosexuality from the realm of sexual aberrations. So this kind of work has been going on, since before the 70s, but really we saw a lot of formal organization around changing classification frameworks to be more inclusive for a long time now. And then also in the 80s, we have the Racism and Sexism in Subject Analysis Subcommittee's report. They presented this report to the Cataloging and Classification section, which is now the Association for Library Collections and Technical Services. But they came up with a policy that they were working with and 6 guidelines to establish a framework for 3 categories that they wanted to address: the need for changes in the Library of Congress subject headings, and the analysis of placement and terminology used to classify women specifically and racial and ethnic minorities in both the Library of Congress classification and the Dewey Decimal System schedules. And then also compilation of annotated bibliographies, citing research that is already out there. So important to keep in mind that maybe some of the things that we'll talk about later and things that are applicable today, there is a long history of work and movement around making sure that things are accurate. So going into some schemes that we see today. And if you noticed on my first slide, I had a lovely picture of an iceberg, because as much as we're going to get into today, we're still only touching kind of the tip of the iceberg when it comes to all the different schemes that are out there. So we're talking about Library of Congress classification, obviously made by the Library of Congress, used in a lot of academic libraries, but also some public libraries. The Dewey Decimal Classification is a lot in public libraries. Same with Cutter Expansive Classification. There's also the Universal Decimal Classification, which is really an international classification system. More and more, as we'll kind of get to in a couple of slides, with the use of technology as it is now, we can have these international systems and communicate with people on the other side of the globe when it comes to the organization of knowledge. The Superintendent of Documents, the SUDOC system, is for government libraries in the US. The Bliss Bibliographic Classification is for British libraries. I'm not sure if that's public or governmental or not. That might be something to look into. The National Library of Medicine classification, that is in the US for medical libraries. The colon classification is actually an Indian system, and interestingly enough about that, it is not hierarchical. So I'm not an expert in colon classification, but it is interesting to see that there are systems out there that don't have the same kind of underlying structure. And then going off of that, we are seeing some hybrid arrangements, and we'll go into that with an example later. And then kind of like we saw with Thomas Jefferson's collection, there are personal arrangements. It's kind of interesting to think about, we're librarians, we probably have books at home. How do you put your books on the shelf? Does it count as a classification system? It might. So when it comes to applying whatever system we're using, you always want to refer back to the classification schedule, aka your documentation. And even documenting what documentation you're using can be helpful to other librarians in your library. A predecessor of yours, if they left anything of that nature, that can be very helpful. Or if you think about, 10, 15 years from now, when there is a new cataloger at your establishment, what have you left them in terms of documentation? So I really want to stress the importance of documentation and having things clearly accessible. That is the reference. That is the classification schedule. This is how we're using it. This is our schema. This is what our call numbers look like. Having that really clearly documented can be very helpful to not only your institution, but other institutions that you might work with, collections you might share, all of that kind of stuff. There is an interesting relationship between classifications and subject headings, of course, which we've talked about how classification really comes down to the place and the space that it occupies on the shelves. But of course, that does have a very close relationship with the subject of the material itself. So subject headings and classification, while are not always one-to-one, you can see that there's an interesting relationship between those things. And while subject headings, you can have as many as you feel apply. Generally, there's only one classification number that gets used on your spine label. So there's kind of an interesting tug of influences there when we think about subject headings and classification. And I also want to stress the importance of, once you know what classification system you're using, having it be very specific to your collection. It's always helpful to go to the shelves to know what people are browsing, which gets into my next bullet point about your end users. Which sections are most browsed? Also, what are the age of your users? Do you want to have things that are really specific, like specifically classified if you have a more general audience? Or if children are using your collection, do you really want to have super long and specific call numbers? Or would it perhaps be easier for both the librarian's retrieval and your user's retrieval to have maybe broader? It depends. So you really have to know your end users, your community, and your collection as well. And when we're talking about collection, I also want to point out the importance of physical space. We all know that our shelves can sometimes be overstacked, or our smaller libraries in the state of Vermont might have a premium on shelf space. So we want to be thoughtful and consistent about the way that the space gets occupied. And if there is a better classification for something that can also help you out space-wise physically in the library, that might be good justification to go with that classification. It all kind of depends on what your library looks like. And then I did mention the retrieval time as well. More and more, we talk about kind of merchandising the collection, and the way that things are laid out and the classification can either help or hinder that merchandising. And then, of course, your signage as well will be super important, because maybe in a library that uses Dewey, not everyone is going to know that, you know, the 645s or whatever are cookbooks. So you might need to have clear signage despite using the best classification system in order so that your end users can know where they are in the stacks, not based on the classification schedule alone. Does that make sense? Does anyone have any questions or comments? Oh, is there something in the chat? You are all good for arriving late. Let me know if there's anything that I need to cover again, and I'm happy to. So when it comes to applying classification, there are some quick places that are clear and helpful to be able to kind of make a quick and good decision. Because when we're cataloging, we want things to be a good use of time and straightforward enough that we can get it done, move on to the next thing. So always check the Verso page. A lot of that cataloging in publication data, the big block of information about the book material that you are looking at, it might have a Dewey Decimal number. It might have a Library of Congress classification number in there already. That will save you time and energy. If it's not clearly laid out, a good place to check in terms of kind of basing your classification justification on the index, things that are present and popular in the material. Also check the table of contents. That specific information also comes into play with getting subject headings. Those are good places to look for that, but it also could influence your classification. And then also the back cover, sometimes there are kind of subject headings. Usually the book publisher will come up with ones for bookstores that are easily found. And then we'll go into this later. We'll look at the website OCLC Classify, which is a wonderful website where you can really put in any ISBN number or a title or an author and get the book and see what other libraries are doing across the country in terms of classification. And we'll look at that website later because it's very helpful. Another option, of course, is to go to the Library of Congress catalog, see if the book is in there, and see what the classification number is there. Comparison always helps. We love having references. And then Goodreads can also lend a hand in you coming to terms with what classification you want to use for an item based on their tagging system. Once again, it's a little bit like what we talked about in a past subject headings class, using those various resources out there in a creative way to help you come to a decision about what might work best based on what's going on at your library. So here's an example of a book, Fever, How Rock and Roll Transformed Gender in America by Tim Riley. So there's a lot going on in this one book. We have gender, we have a location, the United States, we have the concept of rock and roll, we have the larger concept of music. So here are some Dewey Decimal numbers where it would make sense for this book to go on your shelf, especially depending on what your collection already looks like, what it consists of, and then who your readers are. So if you, especially if you have, let's say, if you're working at an academic library, while you'll probably be using Library of Congress, I wanted to put kind of a Dewey option there where you might have a gender studies class, and therefore you would want to go with the 370.81. Maybe you do have a big section of that at your public library and it gets used. That could make sense. Or if you want to go with rock and roll music, 781.66, or just music itself, 781. These are all, they're all justifications for that. And then even more specific, gender identity and music, 780.81. So I know that when I see this, I could say to myself, wow, I could spend like an hour going through all the different options. But once again, we want to go back to what is the clearest perception of the item, and then what are my users looking for? Who is my audience? Where is it going to go? What are the space limitations in my library? Maybe your 700 section is really, really tight already as it is, and you don't want to weed out anything you have already. Would that be good enough? A reason to maybe put it in the 370s.81. Maybe that's an emerging collection that you're trying to do more collection development around. There could be a whole list of justifications of using different classification, but it really comes down to catalogers' judgment. Any thoughts that are coming up before moving on to different schemes and looking at some mark fields? Anything that's coming up for people? Any examples that anyone wants to bring up? Let me know. Feel free to use the chat or just come on camera. I see there's a hand. Myrna, would you like to share?
Yes, I do come upon, we're a small library, and I'm still trying to figure out what the numbers and the topics are connected. I'm
Yep.
new to library cataloging. I do not know where any documentation was left. I think I'm going to ask that our next trustee meeting. But I know that as a user, it would benefit me to have those little labels saying this is our gender, this is our garden. It would really, and that not all books fit under one label. What I do not quite comprehend is how is the classification that the Library of Congress gives helpful? Because it's just a whole bunch of numbers. I mean, I can connect to that. But anyways, that's my
Yeah.
comment.
We will go into Library of Congress classification and the way that it's set up and kind of what those different parts of the classification number mean. So hopefully it'll be a little bit clearer after today for you. Dina has put in the chat, our books come classified and cataloged from Brodart bibs. Yep. What can we assume about how they are coming up with their numbers? That is a fantastic question. And once again, it gets back to what does your library look like? What do your library users look like? Or what are they interested? When are the most popular sections? Are people big on browsing? Are they big on searching the catalog where the space and the place for the book maybe doesn't apply as much in their retrieval process? So that's a really great question. And then also kind of gets back at, what does Brodart use for justification? I would think that they would probably look at what the Library of Congress comes up with, that cataloging and publication data. I'm wondering, as like a general poll, have people received books from a book jobber like Baker and Taylor or Brodart? And said, well, that call number doesn't make sense, and changed it? I know I have. Yeah, often, says Sarah. Yeah. Yep. Yeah, so that's interesting. That's a good question. What can we assume about how they're coming up with their numbers? That's definitely a worthwhile question. Michelle says, yes, we do it all the time. Definitely. Yeah. Well, that's good. Good cataloger's judgment really makes that difference. And hopefully, if a cataloger is doing their job well, our patrons won't notice. Sarah says, I think sometimes in the time between pre-publication, yep, this is a good point, and when it hits the shelves, some things change. Yeah, that's very true as well, especially when those pre-publication decisions are being made yeah, subjects aren't necessarily set in stone. Gina shares a long time ago, I got a book from Baker and Taylor. It was the Bible passage of the Song of Solomon and came with the spine label, Fiction, Morrison. Yes. Yep, I have seen that before as well. Yeah. Yeah. So that's a good reminder for catalogers to be on their toes and paying attention to what the spine labels say, even if they're coming from a book jobber. Cool. Awesome. Thanks, everyone. All right. So as Myrna brought up, the Library of Congress is frequently used, especially in the cataloging in publication data, since it's made by Library of Congress. So this was created primarily by Herbert Putnam in 1897, although I think it's kind of always been a pretty big collaborative process in order to get things set in stone, although as we'll talk about, things are not set in stone always with classification schemas. It incorporates the Cutter expansive classification, which we'll get into what that means in a couple slides here. Typically, large or academic libraries use this system, and it consists of 21 different classes that are represented by a letter. Then there are subclasses also represented by a letter, and then there's usually 1 to 4 digits with decimals for specificity. So here, like with all of my presentation slides, there's always a link to the MARC information about which field this goes into. We have the 050 field for the Library of Congress call number. MARC has a built-in slot just for this classification system because it is so popular. There are a lot of ifs listed on that website page in the manual. And there's almost always a corresponding, in this case, it's 090. We'll see in the next couple of examples. It's usually in the 09X field. There's a corresponding field for local use. So if it's not assigned by the Library of Congress, if a public library is assigning it, they can put that there instead of the field for the Library of Congress number that was assigned by Library of Congress, which also is in the indicators. It's noted who is assigning that number. So Cutter numbers, we're going to talk about Cutter next, but I wanted to get into this since we're here. If you notice, after the subfield B, there are more letters, which has to do with Cutter. In this example, there is not. It has the class letter E. It has a number, including decimals, and then the year. Typically, the year is always included in Library of Congress classification as well. I don't think I put in here the breakdown of all the classes, but that is easy enough to find online. And I think on the syllabus, there is a link to those classes kind of spelled out. So what E might be referring to. When we talk about Cutter numbers, based on the Cutter expansive classification from 1882, this is an international system. It consists of both numbers and punctuation, decimals, and letters as well. I think I maybe meant to write letters as well in that. Typically, it is in alphabetical order and reflects alphabetical order when it's lined up on the shelf. And that can be pertaining to the author's last name, or the title of the item, or the subject. It really depends on how someone is using the Cutter classification and based on the table. So here is the Cutter table pertaining to the second character. So the Cutter number for the word Cutter is going to start with C, because in this example, we're going to be basing this on, let's say this is an author. Cutter will be the last name, so it's going to start with a C. And then if you use the table, okay, the second character in the word cutter is a U. So that's going to be under other consonant, U is an 8. Okay, so it'll be C8, the third letter, and depending on your classification decisions, really, how you want to adapt the schema to your library, you can decide whether you're going to do 2 spaces or 3. In this case, it's 3. T is in this cutter table for additional character. T, the letter T is going to fall under 8 as well. So the cutter number for the word cutter is going to be C88. So that could be a classification system on its own, or C88 could show up in a Library of Congress classification number as well to say, okay, here's the item. This is kind of more of its subject. Here's notation of the author and then the year. So the cutter system exists on its own, but it is also a facet of the Library of Congress classification number. Does that relationship make sense? I thought it was worth mentioning or going into the government document classification number. Once again, you'll find that in the, oh, well, I think I should point out first that when it comes to cutter, you're putting it in other classification number mark field 084. So there's not a designated mark field for something like cutter classification, but that doesn't mean that you can't still add it to the record using this other classification number field. And it is repeatable because you could have multiple classifications, but you have to think about really only one spine label. So, okay, so in 086, that's where we find different government ones. And if you notice, the first indicator, if it's a 0, it's going to be that SUDOC system. Also, interestingly enough, if it's a 1, it's Government of Canada publications. So it's interesting that when we're talking about these mark fields, once again, indicators are always very important and always mean different things based on what field you're working in. So in this case, these two can be represented very easily. Otherwise, you would put a subfield 2 and have a code for what system you're using. So typically, federal document repositories are the ones using this field for federal documents. That makes sense in the USA. Interestingly enough, it was created by Adelaide Hassa, one of the only women classifiers other than Dorothy, who was a refiner of a classification scheme, not necessarily just a creator. So that's interesting to think about. Once again, who is coming up with these schemes? And the classes are based on the issuing body of government. So if it's your agriculture department, it's going to get its own call number. If it's your Department of Libraries, it's going to be also a different letter to start with. If it's your legislation, it'll be a different first letter class number. So that's interesting to think about. And then also the fact that there are 3 parts to this call number. So the issuing body is the first letter. Then there's a series designation representing the type of document, which is shown in digits. And then there's the book accession number. So the way that these materials are going to be lined up on the shelf is really going to be by who issued them and then when. It'll be in accession order on the shelf. Here are some examples of that. And the field 099 is based on local conventions for use of SUDOC. Okay, so when it comes to Dewey, 1867, Melville Dewey created this system of classification. It is currently owned by the OCLC since 1988. It is used by small or medium libraries, and of course, worth mentioning, mostly nonfiction. We are currently on the 23rd edition of the Dewey Decimal System. It consists of 10 classes. Each of those are 3 digits plus decimals, typically. There are 10 main classes, then 10 divisions of those, then 10 divisions of those, which is a little bit hard to explain. Here we go, the breakdown of how to represent this in the MARC, and then a couple of examples. So our indicators here are saying that this is the full edition and it was assigned by the Library of Congress. The Library of Congress said this is a good Dewey number to use. And as you can see in subfield 2, this is actually from the 22nd edition. I just pulled these out of the MARC 21 handbook, so they may not update their examples, but it's still relevant and good to use. Field 092 is based on local conventions of Dewey. So something to think about when we're going through kind of what MARC fields to notate things. When it comes to the MARC fields, especially when you are part of a shared catalog, when should you add or omit classification? And if it's you yourself applying classification, can we truly be objective in applying classification? I think our conversation from a little bit earlier when we're talking about receiving material from a book jobber and seeing that they've applied a number that maybe doesn't fit our libraries perfectly, it kind of shines a light on the fact that maybe objectivity, especially with classification, doesn't exist, or maybe exists and we can get towards it, close to it, point to it. But it may not be relevant if you're in a shared catalog to add a MARC field with what you think the correct classification could be, because it might just not apply to another library. On the flip side of that, it might be a good thing to add because then you're saying, hey, this is a suggestion, and it could help a cataloger down the line make a decision for their classification, if they're going to go with that, if they're going to think about, oh, maybe let's go broader based on that number. So pros and cons. When it comes to different Dewey tools, there's a wonderful visualizer from Library Thing. It shows the classes really easily. I don't think I'll pull it up. If I have time in between, I'll pull it up. And then the second resource here, OCLC Classify. This is going to pull from all sorts of libraries, but it'll tell you how many libraries are using this specific classification for this specific material, which can be really easy, super fast, quick, easy to use, and we love that. And then the Dewey blog is worth mentioning because while I think the author just kind of retired from the site this past year, there is still a plethora of conversation and going back and forth and spelling things out really clearly about kind of the mental process that one goes through when coming up with justification for using a specific number. And all of these links are on the syllabus that is on the Niche Academy site, which if anyone needs access to, I can help you out with that. And they're on the syllabus, which I might just email out to make sure everyone has it. There's a ton of information there and articles that are worth note. All right. We have 15 minutes talking about some current events. More and more, I am seeing webinars and conference sessions on ditching Dewey. Interesting conversation. And the rise of reader interest classification, which could just be lay language, popular terms. Some of the reasonings that I've heard for people leaning towards this are the following. Number one being that it's not intuitive to users. People don't understand what the numbers mean. Okay, I can understand that. There's also an argument that the way that Dewey is set up inherently in its framework, it reflects cultural bias, a Western point of view, typically Caucasian, very Christian, also very male. From one of the articles that I've linked in the syllabus, there's this great statement here that globalization has promoted bibliographic control, system development, and application at the international level. That's great. And it has also contributed to the increasing awareness of problems in existing systems. So as we get more and more connected, we get more and more people saying, hey, that doesn't make sense. That doesn't feel right. That reflects cultural bias and, you know, on a personal level may be offensive. And then there's also the situation where Dewey doesn't necessarily have room for intersections of identity and representing interdisciplinary fields where there are many different fields of study listed here, like LGBTQ plus studies, African American studies, that aren't well represented because they are represented in either too many places instead of one consistent place within Dewey. And then there's also the move to reflect schools and bookstores, which are more and more going towards kind of language-based classification systems. That being said, there are also reasons to stick with Dewey. One being standardization, especially in an international realm. The fact that Dewey consists of digits means that it's not an English-based notation. So on your call number, you don't have a word written out that might be a barrier to a user who doesn't speak English or does not have English as their first language accessing that material, which is something to think about. You can also be really specific in Dewey. There's also some flexibility in Dewey, which our guest, Matthew, will get into. And once again, this kind of with all the classification systems mentioned today, more or less, Dewey, for sure, is actively being revised. There are groups of people, organizations that are trying to revise Dewey. So it's an ongoing process. And also something I didn't mention with ditching Dewey, once again, based on the size of your library, the layout of your library, it may work better, it may not. It really depends on the library, the size of the collection, and your users. So a lot to consider. There are a couple of articles, including a couple of articles in the syllabus that talk about Glade system. This is something that's come up. I believe it was created at the Darien Library in Connecticut, and it groups together these different Dewey Decimal regions into broad subject areas. And it's often incorporated with color on the shelves, and it is reflecting that bookstore browsing approach where you're going to have things that, you know, go together: nature and environment, science, animals, that goes together in nature and STEM, math, engineering as well, technology, food and drink, cookbooks, beverages, food and cuisine, all of those going together. That makes sense. So it's interesting to see that arise. I think there have been some instances of libraries implementing this system and then reverting back. but it all depends on what your library looks like and what your users and librarians can really function well with. And we're almost through my slides here. I want to think about, why are there less popular alternative classification systems than subject thesauri? In past presentations I've done on subject headings, it's like, okay, here's the one alternative for this specific topic. That right now doesn't really exist with classification. It could be because there are so many different classification systems that have been working well for so long. But things to think about from this paragraph here: mass classification systems, once they are formalized and established and have centralized control over information, can be very difficult to change in substantial ways. All catalogs inevitably show their creators and maintainers' point of view about the organization and the management of specific information at a specific moment in time. That's important to remember, not to mention their views regarding who should have access to that information. And there is no such thing as wholly neutral or objective cataloging, especially when the material has often been subject to censure in the past and present. However, librarians can improve the responsiveness and user-friendliness of catalogs by incorporating users' own terms for and definitions of concepts, and by considering the very act of seeking information as radical in and of itself. There's a lot to think about, and I want to leave enough time for our guest presenter. But just kind of more points to ponder when it comes to classification. So I'm happy to take a couple of questions. We have about 5 minutes, and then I'm going to hand it over. I'm happy to pull up the syllabus or anything like that and go over it. I want to make sure that I didn't leave anything out that I wanted to say. I think we're okay. I'm going to post this recording on Niche Academy and the Vermont Department of Libraries website for past webinars. So all of this material will be accessible online. And of course, I'm always open to questions in the future. Maureen asks, any advice on dealing with oversized books? That's a good question. I think I may need some clarification. When it comes to classifying oversized books, I mean, I've always seen oversized books being a smaller percentage of public libraries' collections. So that helps with classification in that you can be a bit broader. You maybe don't have to be as specific. Yeah, if you have more specific questions about that, I'm happy to make comment. I'm going to move on to Sarah's question for now, though. I was asked to organize the history and politics section of the library's book sale. Oh, interesting. That's interesting in itself to think about classifying for a book sale versus classifying for a public library. I wasn't sure how to approach the task without resorting to assigning Library of Congress or Dewey Spine numbers. Is there a guide I could use to display books in this category, similar to how people browse in bookstores? Yeah, that's a good question. I would look at the BISAC subject headings. I think that's probably going to be your easiest way to do that. And on the OCLC Classify online page, let me get to that. On this link here, they actually have the Dewey number and the BISAC subject heading. Oh no. All right, I'm gonna stop presenting. All right, so that's a good website to use. And okay, let's see here. Our library has a folio section for oversized books. A folio section. Oh, okay. That works. All right, I see more people typing. We do have about 2 more minutes and then I'll hand it over to Matthew. Let's see what our typers are saying. Yep, we're getting a little bit of background noise. Good. Want to All right. Are we good on questions for right now? And we might have time for questions later. In the meantime, I will pull up one last slide here to introduce our guest presenter. Is my computer no, we're good. Okay, so Mr. Jaquith is enjoying a diverse library career with professional experience in both college and public libraries. Starting at Brown University, he started as their stack manager, overseeing the work of shelving, sorting, shifting, and storage for a 2-building, million-plus volume collection. Reference work began at the Wilbraham Public Library in Massachusetts before settling into service at the Springfield City Library. At Springfield, he coordinated adult programs and secured thousands of dollars in grant money to help fund those events for close to a decade. 2 promotions followed, the first of which saw him working as branch supervisor for a dynamic and very popular neighborhood library, and a second promotion to supervisor of technical services, where he continues today. Here, he oversees the day-to-day operations of acquisitions, cataloging, repair, and processing. Publishing credits include gay and lesbian materials in the Amherst College Library, a bibliography. His paraprofessional experience was both Amherst College, acquisitions, book repair and circulation, and the Jones Public Library. We are so happy to have him today sharing this specific project with us. So I will stop sharing here and let you take it away, Matthew.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Lauren, for that thought. To be here, joining you librarians from Vermont. Though I am in Massachusetts, just one town from the Connecticut border, so the opposite side of the state in Springfield, Massachusetts. I do have family ties to Vermont, and some of you may know of the Jaquith the Jaquith Library up in Marshfield. It's a little northeast of Montpelier in Washington County, and get up there every now and again to see the good folks in Marshfield. So Vermont is in my heart and in my day-to-day life quite often, as I still have family up there. Thank you for joining me. Let me pull up the presentation so we can have some visuals, and then we'll jump right into it. It looks like my slide closed, so let me open it up again. Yeah, Lauren, it's not populating in the box, so let's pull it here.
Okay, I can pull it up for you on my end.
Oh, here it is. It was just slow to load. All right, so now it's here.
Great.
Great.
And
so
we
are you
can
all
see
able
that.
to see the? Great. Okay, super. So the point of our time together today, and I figured I'd give about 20 minutes for talk, and then we'll leave some time for questions and answers, is to review OCLC's alternative arrangement for the Dewey 200s. That's the religion section. There is, of course, the standard default section, which comes up with this in the CIP and in the MARC 082 very often. But there was criticism, concern about that standard default. Some of the reasons why Lauren alluded to in her earlier talk. And as such, OCLC brought together a study group before the pandemic. They started this work a while ago to consider, could there be a more contemporary and more useful way to arrange the 200s other than what is currently outlined in Dewey Decimal 23, the current version of Dewey Decimal. The concern that people were having and continue to have is that what you see now is the current Dewey Decimal 23 200 class, broken down by division. So you see the 10 divisions of the Dewey Decimal 200 class, and the blue section in the middle, the 230s all the way to the 280s, reflect Dewey real estate that focuses on Christianity.
Matthew,
So we have our, yes, hello.
It looks like we haven't moved on to, there we go. It moved on to slide 2. I think maybe just a little bit lag. Sorry for the interruption.
That's okay. Do you see slide 2 now?
Yes, thank you.
Great. All right. Yeah. So there's slide 2. And towards the middle of this table, from 230 to 280, you see the great number of Dewey real estate that's dedicated to Christianity. The opening 3 divisions are generalities of what in those opening 2 sections. And then Dewey moves to 220 in the Bible. But then after that, from 230 to 280, 60% of the real estate is dedicated to Christianity. Everything else beyond Christianity is in the 290s. So that would include everything else from a contemporary point of view, meaning current religions, but also historical. So that's a very small amount of real estate dedicated to everything else. That seems like a theoretical inequity. There seems to be an imbalance there that's rather obvious. And from a theoretical point of view, many people have criticism about the balance thereof. Beyond the theory, though, there is also some practical criticism about the current arrangement. And this third, since everything else besides Catholicism and Protestantism is in the 290s, that means that that small class has to get an awful lot of specificity in order to differentiate between the world's different religions, both past and present.